2 Timothy. You will find that on page 842 in your pew Bible. You can just hold it open as we kind of introduce where we're going. Today, of course, is Mother's Day, and we want to honor mothers for what they do. They do many roles, don't they? Mothers are both, they're doctors on the one hand, they're counselors, they are teachers, they're health inspectors sometimes, they're bus drivers, they're social event planners, and, well, let's be honest, they're judge and jury to many sibling disputes of their children, right? Mothers play many different roles. And so this morning, what I want to do is I want to take all the roles that mothers play, I want to gather them all together, and I want to put it under one overarching umbrella role, if we could call it that, one role under which all other roles fall. And I'll just tell you it right off the bat, and then I'm going to develop it throughout. So it's kind of a long sentence, but I'm going to put it like this. The overarching call of a Christian mother is to devote her life to instilling a God-centered, Christ-cherishing worldview in her children. The overarching, so I'm not saying there's not other roles, but the overarching call of a Christian mother, assuming that, is to devote her life to instilling a God-centered, Christ-cherishing worldview in her kids. So not saying she can make her kids children, but to give them all that worldview, that whole framework. So they, as adults, they can choose to do what they want with it, but that is the mother's role. So the ultimate end, we could put it another way, the ultimate end of mothering is to teach kids to love the Lord their God with all their heart, mind, soul, and strength, and then to show how this works out in every single area of life. So God has designed the home as the primary training ground for what we might just say making disciples. We're supposed to make disciples. This is the primary way that we as Christians make disciples, is we disciple our children. So it's in the home that a child or a teen is to learn who God is, what He has done, what He expects, and how following Jesus affects everything from how you work out those relationships on the playground, to how you choose your career and the path you're going to take in university, to how you express your sexuality, how you learn to use money, all those things. They all get formed in the home. So motherhood is about making disciples. The overarching call of a Christian mother is to devote her life to instilling a God-centered, Christ-cherishing worldview in her children. So my aim this morning, then, is to encourage, to inspire, to challenge you mothers and your husbands and men who are here, along with those maybe who will be future mothers. Good time to start thinking about it now, young single ladies. Good time. On the powerful effect that you can have on your children, and the powerful effect you can have for the sake of the gospel for many, many generations. I personally am the result. I don't even know the woman's name. It's too far back. It's in the 1700s of a man and a woman who knew Christ, who raised children to know Christ, and they raised kids to know Christ. They raised kids to know Christ. And I can't even track it back far enough, but there was some mother somewhere far back there who we know is a Christian, and my family tree is an astounding heritage of grace. You can be that mother. So this morning what I want to do is three things with us as we trace Timothy's story. First of all, I just want us to hear the story of Timothy's mother. Then secondly, I want to just even step outside the Bible for a moment and just tell you an extended story of another Christian mother in history who follows the example of Timothy's mother. And then finally, I want to end with some just practical biblical things on how to fulfill that calling as a mother. So first, let's just begin with Timothy's story. Let's set it up first of all. Timothy, if you were here last week, you know he's not one of the apostles, not one of the 12, but this is a godly man. He, of course, was introduced to Christ by the apostle Paul, and Paul, there's a name you know, is a man who thought very highly of Timothy. Paul met him while he was in his hometown of Lystra, which is now in modern-day Turkey. And here is what it says in Acts 16:2. This is what was written of Timothy when he was probably a late teenager, maybe about 20 or so. It says, "The brothers," that is the church at Lystra and Iconium, "spoke well of him." Wow, that's high praise for, a 19-year-old. Paul then takes this young man, Timothy, he's his mentor, lifelong mentor. He takes him on his missionary journeys with him. He raises him up to be a Christian leader. He so trusts Timothy with his character and with his leadership abilities that he appoints him to be the pastor of the church in Ephesus, and that was a tough church to be a pastor of. You can see Paul's affection for Timothy. We pointed this out last week, but just again, look back at verse 2. To Timothy, he calls him my dear son. You can see Paul's affection for Timothy as well in verses 3 and 4 as we begin our text today. Paul writes, I thank God, whom I serve as my forefathers did, with a clear conscience. As night and day, I constantly remember you in my prayers. Paul had set times of prayer, as Christians should. We should set aside times for prayer. And during his set times, he would always be remembering Timothy. So obviously, Timothy meant a lot to Paul. Then he recalls the last time they were together in verse 4. Recalling your tears, I long to see you, so that I may be filled with joy. Oh, you just feel the emotion of this letter. He's thinking back. Remember, Paul's rotting in prison right now. He's lonely, and he's remembering the last time he was with Timothy. He remembers Timothy's tears as they had to part. These men, this was a band of brothers, these two men. And they had to part, and he can remember his tears, and he longs to see him again. Timothy then goes on to be a faithful pastor. Paul gets beheaded, as we talked about last week. His mentor, Timothy's mentor, his spiritual father, gets beheaded, but Timothy perseveres on. He pastors this church faithfully for about 15 years, and tradition tells us that he was also stoned to death in AD 98 for his faith in Christ. So Timothy is a great man. But the question I want to ask of Timothy this morning is simply this. Where did Timothy get this rock-solid faith that enabled him to persevere through life, endure the beheading of his spiritual father, pastor a really difficult church, and eventually become a martyr? Where did he get that faith? Well, certainly part of the answer must be from Paul himself, no question about that. But Paul identifies a deeper root to his faith. Paul says there's something about Timothy's faith that began long before Paul ever met him. So look again now at chapter 1 and verse 5. Paul says, I have been reminded of that's Timothy's, sincere faith. So Paul's saying, Timothy, I know your faith is real. It's a genuine faith. And now what Paul does is he identifies the root from which this faith has grown. Look at verse 5. I've been reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded now lives in you also. So where did he get this rock-solid faith from? From his mother and grandmother, who evidently devoted themselves to instilling a God-centered worldview in him at a very early age. It's likely, like many places in the world, even here today, that his grandmother lived with him. Maybe her husband passed away, and so she came to live. So clearly she had a major influence. So what a word of praise Paul has for these women. These are first-class women. This is a first-class mother. The root of Timothy's faith can be traced back in generations from his grandmother to his mother, and then they passed it on to him. Now, here's the all-important question, though. What did Timothy's mother and grandmother do to lay this foundation for his faith? See, I want to know, and I trust that if you're a Christian parent here today, you would want to know, because once you become a parent, if you are a believer, this becomes the greatest thing for you. How can you get overwhelmed by it, first of all. You get overwhelmed. God's given me a task to raise this kid. Okay, just raising the kid's a task in and of itself. Then I'm supposed to also provide this kid so that they can come to know Christ. Lord, this is a huge job. And you say, how do I do this? And so it's just like anything else. Once you're actually in it, you suddenly sense the urgency of it, right? You never really cared about stop signs until you were 16, and suddenly you had to learn how to drive. Now they really matter. You really matters. Now you become a parent. How do I do this? How did Timothy get this? Because that's what I want for my kids. Well, turn over to chapter 3 with me. We're going to jump ahead a little bit in our series and quickly touch down on some verses we'll get to in summertime. Chapter 3 and verse 14, Paul again picks up the same theme he's been talking about, we just finished talking about. Paul says, "But as for you, Timothy, continue in what you have learned and have become convinced of, because," note this, "you know those from whom you learned it." So there's the first thing. How did Timothy get this faith? It was modeled to him. They modeled, his grandmother and his mother modeled a God-centered worldview in their lifestyle. And so notice Paul now is saying, Timothy, I'm exhorting you to continue in your faith, and I want you to do this as you remember your mother's faith, as you remember your grandmother's faith. Because you know those from whom you learned it. You know them, Timothy. So he's saying, Timothy, look back to your mother's example. Look back to your grandmother's. Look how they lived their lives and their holiness. You follow that too, Timothy. Continue in it. So modeling, that's the first way we as parents do this. We first seek Christ. We model a lifestyle that follows Him. That's the most powerful thing. But there's a second. Secondly, they systematically and intentionally taught Timothy the Scriptures. Look at verse 15. He knows those from whom he learned it, and how from infancy you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. That's a striking phrase. From infancy. So, in other words, Timothy cannot remember a time when the Bible suddenly started to come into his life. In other words, as far back as his memories go and beyond, the Scriptures were being read around him. Infancy. So, obviously, he couldn't understand it in infancy, but his parents were still speaking the Scriptures. His mother and his grandmother. They were still speaking them. Maybe, I don't know, maybe they had a family devotions time. They certainly took him to synagogue and things like that. The Scriptures were in his life. So, parents, we need to hear this. We are called to teach our children the Scriptures. This is how you raise kids for Christ. Let me just say it all so simply. Sometimes I think as Christian parents we can get overwhelmed. How do I do this? There's so many things. You could really boil it down to just these two things. You model Christ and you teach Christ. You could say you demonstrate and you declare the gospel for those who are at our leadership retreat. Notice this is the same thing as Deuteronomy chapter 6, where God commands, He says, impress these commands on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. But here's the question. Why is teaching the Scriptures to children one of the greatest tasks in parenting? Well, it's said for us. I can't wait to get to this section. Look at verse 15 again. Why are the Scriptures so important? How from infancy you've known the Holy Scriptures. Here's why. Which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. All Scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, so that the man or the woman, the child of God, may be thoroughly equipped for every good work. So clearly it says there, the Scriptures are what teach us the way of salvation. Only those who call on Christ can be saved, but how can a child ever call on Christ if they never hear about Him? How can they know what sin is if it isn't taught? How can they know about the character of God and His grace towards sinners if it's not taught to them? And as we all know, I mean, you're adults, you fully get this already. You can't just be told something once. You get told something once, unless it's something crazy that just blows your mind, it goes in one ear and it usually goes right out the other ear. So it's something that we must be saturated in, if you will. It's the calling of parents, then, to instill a God-centered, Christ-cherishing worldview by doing those two things, modeling and teaching their children. Now, let me make a huge application here. Yes, as parents, we want our children to be well-rounded. We want them to have a good education. We want them to have good social skills. Maybe you want them to excel in sports, maybe in music, maybe both. You want them to become mature, but listen, all of these things are subordinate to the calling of Christ. For what does it profit our kids if they gain the whole world? Academic degrees, success, and all the wealth in the world. What does it profit them if they gain all of that and yet lose their souls? And who is responsible for that? To ensure that they know the way. That's our role as parents. So the foundation of Timothy's faith, the foundation of all children who grew up in especially in a Christian home, their faith, it should be coming from their parents. Timothy's came from his mother and from his grandmother because they modeled to him and they systematically and intentionally taught him the Scriptures. Now, you might be thinking, what about his dad? How come his dad's not brought up in here? The answer appears in Acts chapter 16. Turn back there with me. Acts 16. As you're turning there, I just want to make a parenthetical comment to set some of this in context. When God created men and women, He created them equal in value. He created them equal in dignity. He created them equal in worth. A man is not superior to a woman, and a woman is not superior to a man. But just like on, say, a sports team, or just like in the church, people can be equal in value and yet function in different roles. So God gave a man and a woman different roles in the home. And so the man's role is to take primary, notice that word primary, not only primary leadership for leading his family, for the provision of his family, and for the protection of his family. This is the father's role, primary, not only. And the husband then is to be the one who says, honey, I want to make sure our kids grow up to know the Lord. So I'm proposing, you help me out with this, tell me your ideas. I'm proposing maybe after dinner we read Scripture together and we pray. And then she says, well, that was a great idea, but usually you go for 45 minutes, so I'm thinking we should pull that back to 6. And then, you kind of work it out together. And the husband's saying, okay, I think we also need to get a Bible that will be appropriate for the kids because I still read the King James, and that's probably not going to work so well with the kids. No, I'm just kidding. King James is great, but maybe not so great for the kids. So we'll get a Bible that the kids are going to understand, and I'll research it, and you got to help me on this. So they come together and they work to it. But you see what I'm saying here? Wives are called to joyfully come alongside their husband's leadership and to use their tremendous gifts to make everything come together at the end. But husbands are to take that primary leadership role. The problem is that once sin entered the world, men tend to one of two directions in their relationship with their wives. They tend, on the one hand, to dominate their wives, become that headstrong, I'm the man of this house, you will do what I say, or being angry, or that kind of thing. Tend to either dominate their wives and children, or they become passive and they abdicate their leadership responsibility with their wife and with their children. Can you see? Do I need to illustrate this? No, I don't think so. Men, this is our great sins in our hearts, is to do one or the other. To become domineering or to become passive. Maybe you can see in your own heart which way you tend. I think generally each man will tend one way or the other, but I think we also jump from one to the other all the time. And so, men, what our role then is to come alongside and in a Christ-like servant way to lead our families. It is the mother's calling to instill this God-centered, Christ-cherishing worldview, but I make this parenthetical comment simply to say that husbands bear the primary responsibility to ensure that it happens. So, then what about Timothy's father? Where is he? Well, the answer is here in Acts 16, verse 1. Paul came to Derbe, that's a town, and then to Lystra, where a disciple named Timothy lived. This is when Timothy was 19 or 20. Whose mother was a Jewish and a believer, but whose father was a Greek. The brothers at Lystra and Iconium spoke well of him. There's what I quoted earlier. Paul wanted to take him along on the journey, so, this is going to hurt, he circumcised him because of the Jews who lived in that area, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. What does that mean? Timothy's father, what it means is that he was simply not a Christian. That's all it's saying. Timothy was not a circumcised Jew. If the father was a Jewish man following Judaism, he would most certainly have circumcised his son. But he did not, and that's why we have this painful description of now Timothy wanting to go and minister amongst Jews, but he has this thing that's going to hold him back, and so he has to have that happen to him. But we are reading that his father was a Greek. So his father, what that's simply saying is his father did not follow. Notice it says his mother was a Jew and a believer, but it doesn't say that of his father. He could be a Greek and a believer, but it doesn't say that. He was just simply a Greek man. He's just a normal, if you want to put it this way, he was a Canadian if we were to use our terms. So if Timothy's father will not train up their son in the ways of God, then Timothy's mother Eunice will make sure it happens. She has to take on the leadership role because the father is not. If he will not give the outward sign of the people of God in circumcision, then she'll make up for it with inward substance. If his father was an unbeliever and would not pray for his son, then she would make up for it by devoting her life to praying for her son. So what a woman Eunice is. I mean, what a tremendous, I'm sure she had her faults, but right now we are just seeing what a glowing description of this woman. Wouldn't you agree? History is filled with such godly women. So let me just take now in the second place to tell you another story of a woman who followed in Eunice's footsteps. To encourage you mothers and to just give some more, just flesh all this out a bit more. The second example of a mother whose great passion in child rearing was to see her son know and love Christ was a woman named Monica. She and her husband had a boy on November 13th, 354 AD. So this is an old story. They named him Aurelius Augustinius, or simply Augustine. Do you know that name? Some of you maybe. Every Christian should know that name. Listen to what the publishers of Christian History magazine write. Quote, after Jesus and Paul, Augustine of Hippo, that's the city he lived in, great name for a city, by the way, is the most influential figure in the history of Christianity. Maybe you've heard names like John Calvin or Martin Luther or Thomas Aquinas. You might have heard those names if you go back to your old history classes. Those men, by their own admission, stand upon the shoulders of Augustine. Augustine was a philosopher, a theologian, a poet. He was a tremendous speaker and a godly man. His impact on Christianity is beyond calculation. But until the age of 31, no one would have thought that about Augustine. No one. You see, although he was an absolutely brilliant orator, and in those days to be a public speaker, that was a major thing to be able to do in that culture, and he was amazing at it. Although he was all these things, he was a typical, well, let's say this way, a stereotypical 21st century university hot-blooded male. If there was a frat party, Augustine was probably leading it. He was the guy who, he lived in a great city, and he, by his own admission, he said he basically just slept with women whenever and however much he possibly could do it. He believed in all kinds of weird things. He followed the teachings of a group called the Manichaeans. And here's what he writes of his lust. This is his biography, which is called simply The Confessions of Augustine. And he writes, I dared to roam the woods and pursue my vagrant loves beneath the shades. Now, just translation. I hung out in the forest a lot and I slept with a lot of women. That's what it's saying. He says, lust stormed confusedly within me, whirling my thoughtless youth over the precipices of desire. The torrent of my fornications tossed and swelled and boiled and ran over. So his lust, he's picturing as a pot boiling over, just so filled with this was his whole life. He tells how he threw himself into this life when his friends boasted of their sexual exploits, especially the most debauched ones. Augustine said he wanted to be like that and to even surpass them. This is the lifestyle he was living. And yet, this man goes on to become one of the greatest Christians who ever lived. So what happened to him? Well, he says it has everything to do with his mother, Monica. So let me read to you also from his autobiography. And as I read, I want you to notice he shapes his whole biography as a prayer to God. So when he says you, he's referring to God. He writes about his mother for many different pages. But of his father, he only writes I think it's maybe one paragraph, if I recall correctly, and it all has to do with his education. His father was not a believer, and so he did not really care about the state of his soul, obviously, then, his son's soul. He only cared that his son become one of the great orators in the world. And so here's his one paragraph on his father. He praises him and then doesn't praise him. At that time, This is when he was a university age now. Everybody was full of praise for my father because he spent money on his son beyond the means of his estate when that was necessary to finance an education entailing a long journey. Many citizens of far greater wealth did nothing of the kind for their children. So, a great dad cared much about his academic success and beyond what other parents of that age would do, funded his son's education. But then he writes, but this same father did not care what character before you I was developing, remember you as God, or how chaste I was so long as I possessed a cultured tongue. And that's basically the last time he speaks about his dad. But not so his mother. He considers her to be instrumental in leading him out of darkness and into light. And here's what he writes, for my mother, your faithful servant, wept for me before you more than mothers weep when lamenting their dead children. By the faith and spiritual discernment which she had from you, she perceived the death which held me, and you heard her, Lord. You heard her and did not despise her tears which poured forth to wet the ground under her eyes in every place she prayed. And despite the fact that her son stubbornly refused to listen to her when she wanted to talk about Christ, she kept on praying for him. He writes, for almost 9 years then followed, during which I was in the deep mire and darkness of falsehood. Despite my frequent efforts to climb out of it, I was the more heavily plunged back into the filth and wallowed in it. During this time, this chaste, devout, and sober widow, one of the kind you love, never ceased her hours of prayer to lament about me to you. Wow. And then out of great concern for the false teachings that her son was falling under with the Manichaeans, she went to a pastor, or called a priest in those days, and she tried to convince this priest, go talk to my son and try to teach him and show him the errors of his ways. Listen to her concern for her son. When my mother had entreated him to agree to talk with me, to refute my errors, to unteach me evil things and to teach me good things, he refused, wisely, as I afterwards perceived. He answered that I was yet unteachable, being puffed up with the novelty of that heresy. Let him alone a while, said he, only pray to God for him. By reading he will discover for himself what his error is and how ungodly it is. When he had said these things, and she was still not satisfied, what a great mother, still not satisfied, but urged him even more with pleas and many tears that he would see me and reason with me, he, a little displeased at her persistent urging, said, now listen to this, so after seeing this mother's zeal for her son's salvation shown in her prayers and her persistence, this is what this man says, go your way, and God bless you, for it is not possible that the son of these tears should perish. But she did not just pray. She also tried to speak to Augustine as she was able. She tried to teach him the scriptures, and here's what he says. Whose but yours were these words, which through my mother, your faithful one, you sang in my ears? Yet nothing of what she said sank into my heart so that I would obey it. For she wished, and I remember in private, warned me with great anxiety not to commit fornication, but especially never to defile another man's wife. This seemed to me womanish advice which I should be embarrassed to obey. She was so concerned for his spiritual well-being that she actually sailed over the sea to go and see him and to check up on him, see how he was doing. He told her then that he had now rejected the teachings of the Manichaeans, but he was most certainly not a Christian. After he said this, Augustine writes, most calmly and with a heart full of confidence, she replied to me that she believed in Christ, that before she departed this life, she would see me become a believer. And that hope was realized. God humbled Augustine's pride, and he revealed Christ to him. It's a great story, which I don't have time to give the full length today. I'll give you the summary version. He was with a friend one day and saw a Bible open outside on a table, and he just picked it up to read it, and there was this verse from Romans 13:13, and it says, let us behave decently, as in the daytime, not in orgies and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension or jealousy. Rather, Clothe yourselves with the Lord Jesus Christ, and do not think about how to gratify the desires of the sinful nature." Then Augustine writes these words, "No further would I read, nor did I need to. For instantly, at the end of this sentence, by a light, as it were, of serenity infused into my heart, all the darkness of doubt vanished away. Then we went into my mother, we told her, and she rejoiced. She leaped for joy and triumph and blessed you." This was, of course, her greatest joy. 2 years later, they stood on a porch and they were speaking about the glories of heaven and of God. And his mother said to him, "Son, for my own part, I have no further delight in anything in this life. My hopes in this world are fulfilled. There was one thing which I desired to linger for a while in this life, that I might see you a Christian before I died. My God has done this for me." 5 days later, she fell sick with a fever, and Augustine writes, "Then on the 9th day of her sickness, in the 56th year of her life, and the 33rd of mine, that godly and holy soul was freed from her body. I closed her eyes, and a mighty sorrow flowed into my heart and overflowed into tears. At the same time, my eyes, by a violent command of my mind, drained their fountain totally dry, and how I battled with sorrow." Wow. Another example of a tremendously godly mother. Augustine writes elsewhere that his mother anguished more in prayer for his soul than she did in giving him birth. What an example of a mother who understood her overarching call, who had her priorities straight. Of course, she wanted her son to succeed in the world and to have his degrees and all those type of things. But that was the one thing she longed for above all others, was that he would know Christ. So let me take just our last few seconds together, a few minutes, to just apply this and give a few ways on how should a mother practically go about fulfilling this calling. A few quick bullet points. First, I might say this is the most important. Seek the strength that comes from Christ. Mothers and fathers, do you know the best thing that you can do for your children is to leave them aside and to seek the face of God yourself? The only way you will ever be able to even come close to the example of these women is if you personally are seeking the face of God, so He will shape you, so you'll be in awe of who He is, so that the good news of what Christ has done fills every part of you and your body, or your soul. It transforms you, and then it comes out in the way that you model. It comes out in your speech. It can't work the other way around. So if you want this, you can't just look to the example of these women to carry you. You need to look to the strength of Christ, for He alone can shape you and form you to be the mother that you're called to be. Second, love and support your husband. Again, your example in this area will speak more words than all the words that you speak in your life. Love and support your husband. Third, pray fervently for your children. Never give up on this. Never stop praying. Like Augustine, personally, I also attribute my salvation and where I'm even at this very moment to the prayers of my mother, to the prayers of my father. To this day, they tell me that they still pray for me every single day. That's a big deal. To pray for decades like that. To pray for your children, not just that they would do well in school, but most of all, you pray they would have a heart after the Lord. Fourth, saturate their minds in the Scriptures. Ultimately, it would be great if you could get to once a day, coming to a time when you would sit and read together. Don't make it so long that you burden your children. To pick something age appropriate, here's what we did when our kids were a little younger, the Jesus Storybook Bible by Sally Lloyd Jones. You can come look at it afterwards if you like. You know, ages maybe, 2 to 7. Actually, you know what? There are adults in this church who bought this and read it, because some of the way the language is written in here is so good. Adults could benefit from it too, but really ages maybe 2 to 7 or so, 2 to 8. We've moved now to this one called Long Story Short, And what it does is basically it's called 10-minute devotions to draw your family to God. You don't even have to do anything. If you feel intimidated by this, you don't have to do anything. It begins with, okay, what do you remember about yesterday's story? Read Genesis chapter 1, verses 3 to 25. There's a paragraph you read, and then some questions to talk about. And then you just finish in prayer. It does everything for you. So if you feel intimidated, something like that would be fantastic. And I would be guessing this could be right up to age 14 or so. Spending time in the Word. Personally, this little book right here was what my mom read to me. This will show you it doesn't always have to be age appropriate. This is King James language, and every day it's just June 13th, for instance, it's just got a selection of different scriptures. There's 3 paragraphs of scriptures, and my mom would just read it as we were having breakfast. Maybe it wasn't our official family time, but just reading scripture to me. And I don't even remember this date, but on June 13th, 1980, I was 4, and she says, on that day, I fully understood my need for Christ. I understood my sin. I understood who Christ was. And I can't even imagine. How does a 4-year-old get that? Only by a parent continually reading Scripture and interacting. A 4-year-old does not just get that so easily. So for me, that book means a lot to me and what my parents did in raising me that way. So, saturate their minds in Scriptures. 5th, make life your classroom to teach them a God-centered, Christ-cherishing worldview. Again, this assumes you're growing in all of this, about how you should think about all circumstances in a Christian way. But this is how we do it as parents. There is the kind of official, formal sit-down, but maybe even more effective is the unofficial as things come up. When you discipline them, you teach them about the cross and the grace of God and His love for us. When you see the beauty of creation, when the blossoms are out and you're driving down Dunbar there a few weeks ago, kids, look at the blossoms. Isn't God amazing? Single moment. When you teach them about sexuality, you proclaim the goodness of God's design for it in marriage. Our kids right now in the school system, all kinds of issues being raised, and so Emily comes home the other day and, Dad, can you please explain what gay is to me again? I don't quite understand how 2 women can have babies together. And so we have a discussion. What a perfect opportunity. To have a discussion, to go back to the Word. What does it say? How do we relate to this whole issue in culture, Emily? This is not a simple one. So we need to make sure we relate to it well. So we've had this discussion probably 10 times already, but clearly she's not fully grasped it yet. So we need to keep going with that, keep empowering and keep teaching. Or when we're just sitting down around the house or driving in the car, we just speak to them. And friends, as many of you are parents here today, here's one of my heart concerns. When we want them to excel in sports, we put them in sports, but we make sure that sports does not become the religion of our family. And my concern is for us in the West Side. There are so many wonderful sporting opportunities. And the easiest thing is suddenly we're gone from corporate worship for 3 months because there was tournaments every weekend. I don't think it's wrong. Don't take me wrong to say that you can never ever leave for a game on a Sunday. I don't think there's a legalistic rule here, but here's where I would point you to Hebrews 10, which says, do not give up the habit of meeting together. Is it a habit? It's pretty easy to start defining when something ceases to become a habit. In other words, it should be a rare event so your kids go, wow, that was a break from our normal habit. That's how I'd suggest you approach that kind of issue. So you teach your kids, sports is great fun. I love sports. My kids know I love sports. I love playing sports. I like watching sports. But kids, in our family, there's only one God. There's only one God who gets our worship. And it's not the God of basketball or soccer or hockey or any of these things. They have their place, they're fun, but they're not our religion. So we teach them through everyday life. Life is our classroom. Kids, these are our priorities. And friends, as parents, whatever you make the priorities, defined by how you use your time and your money, whatever you make as priorities and how you live, that is how your kids will grow up. So don't be surprised when they grow up to be just like you, for good or for bad. And finally, I've gone on too long, but this is the final simple one. Just love your children. You just love them, you praise them, you encourage them, and you raise them in the ways of the Lord. May you devote your lives to instilling a God-centered, Christ-cherishing worldview in your children. May God give each of you grace to do that. Let's pray.